for Chapter 6, Corporate Level Strategies. Now, in this chapter, we start with a discussion of the corporate profile. This is the first step in identifying the corporate strategy. Then we talk about the corporate strategy. Another term for corporate is firm here. So firm strategy, corporate strategy, the same thing. We will talk about different means of pursuing corporate growth, growth being perhaps the most popular corporate strategy. We'll talk about when stability is better than growth, and we'll close with a discussion of a popular tool for assessing the strategies of the fit of different businesses within the corporation, that being the Boston Consulting Group, or BCG matrix. Now let's start with a definition. The corporate strategy is the strategy that top management formulates for the overall corporation, so the overall organization here. Again, we call that the firm level strategy. So if you have a corporation that owns multiple business units, you will have one corporate strategy, and then you will have a business strategy for each of the businesses. Now, business strategy is discussed in the next chapter. Just a side comment here: if you read the popular press, watch business networks, you hear a lot of references to corporate strategies and business strategies and organizational strategies, firm strategies. All these terms seem to be used interchangeably. So if you do any research and you're trying to figure out, the corporate strategy for a particular company, you might see corporate strategy referenced in an article, but it's really referring to what we call business strategy. Now, it's not to say that the terms used in this text are somehow the perfect terms for strategy, and corporate has a certain meaning, business has a certain meaning, but these distinctions are very important because you have to think about strategy at three different levels. There is that broad level of strategy where you think about strategy for the overall organization. And then you have a secondary level where you think about strategy for each of your businesses. Of course, it goes to a third level as well, which is the chapter after business strategies. That's functional strategies. We'll get to that later. But at this point, we're concerned with the distinctions between corporate and business strategy. So just know that when you obtain information from other sources or watch news reports on companies, you will hear words like corporate, business, firm used interchangeably. But in the context of our discussion, corporate and firm is the broadest level of strategy, and that's the level we're talking about in this chapter. Now, the corporate profile allows us to think about the kinds of businesses we're going to be operating in, and this is really the first decision or first consideration in terms of creating a corporate strategy. So you have three options with the corporate profile. One of these, the simplest, is to compete in a single industry. And this would be a situation where the corporation owns one business unit, and then that's the only business unit it has, so then it just competes with that one unit. The upside here is that you specialize your efforts. You know your business well, learn to know your business well. But the downside is that all of your eggs are in a single basket. So if there is some type of economic downturn or something cyclical that affects that business, maybe even a crisis in that business, well, you don't have other businesses to draw from. The entire organization is tied up in that one business. Often when you hear about organizations going under, filing for bankruptcy because of difficulties, they often tend to be single business corporations because they just don't have other businesses to draw on when one business is not doing well. The opposite of competing in a single industry is the third option. We'll go to 3 and then come back to 2, is to compete in unrelated industries. And in this, with this option, you'll have multiple businesses, and those businesses are not related. So you might have a business that sells shoes, maybe shoe stores. Then you have another business that sells insurance, and then maybe a third business that manufactures car parts. Okay, so these are 3 totally different businesses. Now, the idea behind competing in unrelated industries with different business units is to minimize risk. You diversify, just the same logic as when you handle your personal investments. You buy different kinds of stock in different industries, different companies. So if one goes up or one goes down, others might be going up, and can balance that out for you. So again, the idea with competing in unrelated industries is to minimize that risk through diversification. Now, the middle ground, going back to number 2, is to compete with multiple business units, but to do so in related industries. Okay, the idea here is to have businesses that are not in the same industry, but because of their relationships, you can build synergy. Synergy is the key term. We talk about it frequently here in the audio commentary, and also you'll see references to synergy throughout the chapter in the book. And synergy is essentially one of those things that happens when two organizations together are worth more than they would be individually. You hear about this in athletics frequently. They talk about how the 5 players on a basketball team are better as a unit than they would be individually because they work so well together. And that's synergy. This is the concept here. The problem with synergy sometimes is it seems like you'll get it. Look at different pieces of a puzzle. It feels like putting them together will make the whole worth a lot more than the individual parts. But sometimes it just doesn't work out that way. So competing in related industries is very attractive. A lot of companies try to do it. Many of them do it well, but there are instances where the synergy just does not materialize. So these are your 3 options going into the corporate profile. If you're doing a case analysis, of course, you should be able to identify this based on the businesses that are held by a corporation before you proceed to the corporate strategy. Now, when you look at the corporate strategy, you have 3 options. And these are pretty basic if you think of them in lay terms. The first is to grow, to increase in size. The second is what we call stability, which is to retain the current size or roughly the current size. And then the third option is to get smaller, to retrench. Okay, so we're going to start with growth and then go through the stability and retrenchment options, growth being thought of often as the ideal strategy. In fact, there are some leaders, corporate leaders, executives who say if you're not growing, something is wrong. You have to be growing. Good, effective firms are always growing. I don't think that perspective is completely true. I think for many organizations, depending on their particular situation, growth may not be ideal. The appropriate strategy for your firm depends on the internal and external characteristics. What's going on inside of your company and what's going on out in the environment. Now, again, the counter argument to that is you need to fix what's going on inside your company and move into an environment where you can grow. Growth is always best, but there are some situations where maybe growth is not. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this commentary. So let's start with different types of growth strategies. The basic breakdown is internal versus external. Internal growth means you grow more by doing what it is you currently do. So for McDonald's, you sell more Big Macs or open more restaurants. Very simple concept. External growth is when you acquire other companies and you grow that way. Now, the thing about internal growth is it tends to be more controlled, maybe a little slower, and it's a good way of growing overall, but it's not. If you want to go rapidly, you need to consider external growth. Now, let's just sort of think about a hypothetical here. What if McDonald's purchased or acquired Burger King? Well, if that's the case, then overnight, McDonald's has a lot of additional outlets, and McDonald's has grown rapidly in one sweep just by acquiring Burger King. Of course, there are lots of problems with that. What do you do with stores that are located next to each other? Do you keep operating both stores? Do you mix the product lines between McDonald's and Burger King? There are a lot of questions that would come from that, but just from a standpoint of growing rapidly, you can see the advantage there of acquiring another business unit. Can be more challenging, but it is something that results in rapid growth. Now, a merger occurs when 2 or more firms, usually of roughly similar sizes, combine into one through an exchange of stock. And the reason why we talk about roughly similar sizes is if one's a lot larger, typically the larger one acquires the smaller one, and that's where we use the term acquisition. So an acquisition is a form of merger where A acquires B instead of A and B just coming together and agreeing to become a new firm. The end result's the same. You're combining 2 companies into one. And again, this is what we see when we look at external growth. Now, as this slide points out, external growth again can occur and usually occur more quickly than internal growth, but there can be challenges when you attempt to combine the companies or combine the businesses into a single organization. You see this frequently in high-profile mergers, where two companies come together and they say we're going to be the best of both worlds, and we're going to combine technology and service and so forth, and then things just don't work out. The Daimler-Chrysler merger is one of the famous mergers that just flopped, frankly. It had a lot of potential, and the idea of the Germans coming together with the Americans in terms of building the best car and so forth, but there were a lot of cultural differences, a lot of hesitation to share technology. A lot of things went wrong in that, and they eventually split up again. Now let's talk about some different types of growth here, and more specifically than just the internal-external. The first of these is what we call horizontal related integration. So if you acquire a company in the same line of business, so this would be McDonald's acquiring Burger King, then you're talking about horizontal integration. The way to think about that is horizontal. You're going across the line in terms of thinking about companies and industries, and you're just integrating. You're working with another company at the same level. And the idea here is that you get larger without expanding into different businesses. So again, this is referred to as horizontal related integration. We also have horizontal related diversification. And this is where you acquire a business outside of your operation, but with similar or related core competencies. Or another way of putting this is you're acquiring a business that moves you from being involved in a single industry to one situation where you're involved in multiple related industries. The idea of core competencies is that the firm's key capabilities and the collective learning skills that are fundamental to strategy, performance, and long-term profitability are similar. So you acquire a company that has some type of similarity. Maybe you share technology. Sometimes the trucks just deliver to both businesses in the same way. You could see that in the hypothetical McDonald's Burger King merger, that the truck delivers French fries to McDonald's. The same truck can deliver the fries to Burger King, on the same trip. So you can see just a lot of similarities that might come together. Now in that case, though, again, that was an example of horizontal related integration. This one would be diversification. So what would happen if McDonald's acquired, say, a chain of Mexican restaurants? You say, well, maybe that's the same industry. Depends on how you look at it. But if you think in terms of fast food versus, the Mexican or more of a traditional sit-down restaurant, that moves into a different industry. But you can see the relationship there. Still, you would have some overlap in terms of skill and employee training mechanisms, and even some of the sourcing of the food that is sold in the restaurants. Another approach is conglomerate or unrelated diversification. And this is where you move to that third option on the corporate profile, where you just acquire a business that is unrelated to your business, and often deliberately unrelated. It might actually have a complete cyclical relationship that's very different. So in other words, when it might be a business that excels when the economy is doing poorly. So if your business excels when the economy is doing well, then you have something to balance it out during bad economic times. We also talk about vertical integration. And vertical integration occurs when you acquire a firm up or a business that's up or down the chain in terms of supply. So if a firm acquires its suppliers, it's engaging in what we call backward integration. So if I produce a product, if I build cars and I buy the suppliers, or maybe one or more suppliers that provide parts for my car manufacturer, then we would call that backward integration. Now, if a firm acquires its buyers, in that case, you would say GM might be purchasing or acquiring dealers that sell GM vehicles. Then we call that forward integration. Now, obviously, not every company can participate in both, because if you're a service company, you sell directly to consumers, you can't really buy your consumers, so you can only go one way. Many companies can go both ways. The idea of vertical integration is to increase the control you have over the supply chain. You can secure your sources of supply. You can become your own customer, so you don't have to deal with others purchasing from you. But the downside of vertical integration is that you make commitments. Because if McDonald's buys a farm that produces potatoes for its French fries, well, now McDonald's has to buy its fries from that farm, even if the farm is not the most efficient producer of those fries. So sometimes you lock in suppliers by doing this, but then you become committed to them. Now, another form of growth is a little bit different. We call this strategic alliance. Sometimes the term partnership is used here. Now, strategic alliance occurs when two or more firms share the costs, risk, and benefits associated with pursuing a new business opportunity. Now, notice that they don't change ownership here. The idea is that they just agree to work together. So maybe a car company in the US and one in China, this of course has occurred many times, get together and say, well, we'll share technology, and maybe the US company provides technology, the Chinese company provides access to market, and then they have a strategic alliance and work together. The upside of strategic alliance, of course, is that you're still able to maintain your own organization. You don't have to share that ownership, but you do have benefits on the positive side where you're able to get something that the other organization has that you currently don't have. So these are the different forms of growth strategy. Again, growth is very attractive. A lot of companies look to this as an option, but it's not always the best alternative. The second approach is what we call stability. And stability is when you attempt to maintain your present size roughly. And I say roughly because if you grow at the pace of inflation, that's still roughly, we would call that stability. But this can be attractive or more attractive than growth under several circumstances. Under one situation, the industry growth might be slow or non-existent. So another way of looking at this, if the industry is growing at a very slow pace, or it's maybe not growing at all, then the only way you can grow relative to companies in that industry is to expand your business at their expense, which means you get larger because somebody else gets smaller. That's very difficult. It's very costly sometimes to make happen, which gets us into number two, where the costs associated with growth just don't exceed the benefits. Sometimes getting larger just costs a whole lot. There's one of the historic battles in sort of American business, goes all the way back to the cola wars between Pepsi and Coke several decades ago, where they just spent tons and tons on advertising and taste tests and giveaways trying to take market share from each other. And at the end of the day, Coke and Pepsi walked out with the same market share, roughly, that they had at the beginning. The point being is that they spent a lot of money, but it's just very difficult for Pepsi to bring in a lot of Coke drinkers and Coke to bring in the Pepsi drinkers. And they sort of called a truce at this, and they just continued, of course, even today, to be two dominant cola providers. And they have other drinks and beverages, so forth. But they just agreed that they would not try to take each other's market share at that level. Now, when I use the word agree, I don't mean there was a formal agreement. What I'm saying is that they looked at the situation and both sides concurred that they were just spending too much on the marketing side, that the growth they were trying to achieve just simply did not justify, or wasn't justified by the cost that had to be incurred along the way. Another interesting reason why stability can be a good option is that sometimes growth can place a lot of strain on quality and customer service. This is a bit debatable. I mean, there's some consultants and others who say that as your company gets larger, you can maintain all the great service you had when it was small, but I'm not sure that that's really true. I think there's something to be said about a small company that provides a high level of service, and just trying to grow too fast. Sometimes you lose the connection with your customers. You hear a lot about people who like to go to certain businesses because they're called by name, and the guy working there knows exactly who they are, what their situation is, what their needs are, and you just can't retain that in a super large company. And of course, the quintessential example is going into Walmart and trying to get specialized or personal service on a particular specialty part, maybe something in hardware, maybe in sporting goods, and you just don't, there's a lot of turnover there. The people there don't know who you are. you're lucky to get any kind of basic advice. But if you go to a hardware store or maybe a sporting goods store, specialty store, the people there, because it's a small store, they concentrate on one area and they get to know who you are. Now they're small, and if they get too large, then they lose that. So a Dick's Sporting Goods, for example, that is a large sporting goods store, sort of becomes the Walmart of sporting goods, and then they lose that personal touch. So there's an argument to be made that when you get too large, you just often lose that focus on quality. And finally, number 4 here is you have a situation where large dominant firms might not want to risk prosecution for monopolistic practices. And this is a tough area to break into if you're not familiar with the notion of regulation in this area. If you get too large, often you are punished essentially for being for pursuing monopolistic practices. Different examples of this: Microsoft has been charged with at some point owning such a large percentage of the market with the Windows operating system, and they can slip other things in with Windows, other types of software on their computers, and competitors or rivals would then when challenge them and say, hey, it's not what you're doing is not fair. At some point, maybe it's better for Microsoft just to say, okay, we're going to stay where we are and concentrate on our current business, because getting larger is just going to attract a lot more regulatory attention. So something to consider. This is not valid for all firms, but there are some firms that fall into this category. So what about retrenchment? Retrenchment is when you are trying to get smaller. Now, you can't do that forever, I guess. At some point, you get so small you don't exist. But there are times you might want to retrench. Maybe there's a crisis or an economic downturn or something change in the industry that requires you to get smaller for some period of time. Now, this is a deliberate reduction in size. So when you retrench, you are saying, based on whatever scenario we're in, we're trying to get smaller. Now, retrenchment is often accompanied by reorganization, a process of reorganization known as corporate restructuring. Technically, corporate restructuring is changing the structure, and we do talk about structure several chapters down the road. But for now, we'll just say that corporate restructuring is a broad term that often refers to lots of different changes that are really about companies maybe getting smaller in the short run in order to revamp and retool so that they can grow again. 3 types of retrenchment available. The first of these is turnaround. This is the most conservative approach, and this is where you say, okay, we're going to maybe close a few plants, stop selling a few products, maybe trim the size of the workforce. We're going to make some changes to come back as a leaner, meaner company, be more successful as a competitor. Divestment is a little bit more serious. This is when you go in and get rid of a business unit. What you're essentially doing here is saying, look, one of our businesses is not working. We don't want to retool it. We want to sell it to somebody else, and someone else, hopefully, because of this concept of subjective value we talked about in Chapter 1, someone else would want our business unit and they can run it perhaps more effectively than we can. The final option is liquidation. This is when you sell the business unit. Okay, and a complete liquidation is when you sell all of your business units. You decide there's really no future in the corporation at all. Everything's sold. You get pennies on the dollar. You close things down. So liquidation is rarely recommended from a practical standpoint, but there are times when companies need to liquidate. Well, this gets us to step 9 in the case analysis process. And this is identifying the corporate strategy, or again, firm level strategy, same thing here. And we start with the corporate profile. Remember, we need to understand the corporate profile before we can delineate the corporate strategy. So do we want to be in one industry, in related industries, or unrelated industries? We need to identify and justify that. And then we identify the corporate strategy. And it's not enough to just say the firm is growing or the firm is pursuing stability or retrenchment. Be very specific. What kind of growth? Just because the company is getting larger doesn't mean it's pursuing a growth strategy. Now, typically that's the case, but sometimes a company has gotten larger for the last 5 or 6 years, but then going forward has a totally different set of ideas in terms of where the company should move. So be comprehensive in your research in this area. Well, let's close our discussion here in this chapter by talking about the BCG growth share matrix. And this is really a connection or a linchpin, if you will, between the corporate and firm level of strategy and the business level we talk about in the next chapter. Because in the BCG matrix looks at the corporation that holds multiple business units and says, okay, do we hold the right combination of business units? And we can think of this, of the different types of business units in four ways. We can look at the industry growth rate and the relative market share. And based on whether they're high or low, we can have four different types of businesses. Okay, so again, if we want to just put this in other words to make it clear, if you're a company that has, let's say, 5 different business units, you can plot these 5 business units in these 4 boxes. Either you can do it literally by just categorizing them, or you can actually put a little dot or somewhere on the matrix, depending on where you think they are. Now, the stars are the most attractive types of businesses. Stars are businesses that have a high relative market share, and they also have a high industry growth rate. So these are the guys who are doing really the best in an industry that is growing rapidly. Everybody wants a star. The only problem is there are not that many out there. Okay, the opposite of the star is the dog. The dog has a low market share in an industry that is not growing or maybe even declining. Not too many dogs as well, because you get rid of dogs if they don't provide that value. Okay, most of the businesses you have tend to be the question marks and maybe some cash cows, because these are the ones that are intriguing. A cash cow, for example, is in an industry that's not growing rapidly, but the market share is pretty high. So you've got a pretty good stake of an industry, but the industry is not growing. And we call it a cash cow because you might want to just milk it for all the cash it's worth and use that cash for developing other businesses. The opposite of the cash cow is the question mark. The question mark has a low relative market share, but the industry is growing rapidly. So here you're a small player in an industry with a big future, but you know what? There might be lots of other small players as well. There's going to be some development involved. Now, if you look at the matrix and you see the red line, that the diagonal that goes from the upper left corner to the bottom right corner, on the right side of that, the question mark side, this is the need, or reflects the need for cash or capital investment for growth. On the cash cow side of the line, these are businesses that produce the cash or capital that you may not want to be investing in. So if you plot all of your businesses, a very simple, maybe overly simplified way of looking at this is if you have some cash cows that are developing capital, then that capital can be used to develop your question marks. So you don't want to have a corporation that has only question marks or only cash cows. Again, ideally, you'd love to have a corporation with all stars. You probably don't have those. So you want to think about a type of balance. And again, when you think about the different options you have for strategic managers, we talked about some of these a couple of minutes ago. With a star and a question mark, you want to build that market share because you have a growing industry. You might want to hold market share with the cash cows. You don't want to get out of business, but the industry's not growing, so you want to extract as much cash as possible and then harvest as much and use that cash for other types of businesses. And you might also want to divest business units, particularly the dogs. So again, if we think in terms of this matrix, it doesn't mean that once we plot all of our businesses that we now know exactly what we want to do in terms of, do we want to develop this business or sell this business? But it's just an interesting way to think about the portfolio that we have with us. Now, some closing comments here on corporate strategy. Now, the corporate strategy can involve our company at various levels outside of our domestic country. So at the minimum level, we can think in terms of what we call international involvement. At a greater level, it becomes multinational. And then at the maximum level, we use the word global involvement. Now, these terms are used interchangeably, again, in the popular press. So there's nothing magical about them, but the idea here is to just to clarify that there are different levels of involvement outside of the host country. So at the level we refer to as international, it's a very basic level. You import products, export products. You might provide licensing for another company in another country to produce your product there, even maybe some franchising options or strategic alliances where you don't exchange ownership of the company. If you move to option 2, what we call the multinational level, you add to that the direct investments in other countries. So you now own production facilities in another country perhaps, or maybe even distribution there. But the subsidiaries that operate in the different countries here operate independently. So this means that if you have a company, say in the US, and then you own a production facility in Asia, those would be managed differently, different sets of managers, but they are just owned by the same corporation. If you want to move to the maximum level of involvement, we refer to that as global involvement. And this is where we add the notion of direct investments abroad. And at this point, the subdivisions are interdependent. So you operate this corporation as one big whole. So you might have different locations, facilities all over the world, but you don't think of them as being different in terms of being managed separately. You manage them as an integrated firm. So you think in terms of supply chains, of production occurring in one part of the world that moves to another part for finishing the manufacturing, and then goes to a third part for distribution and selling your end products. So this is how we think about the notion of global involvement. So how would you determine the extent to which your firm should be involved? I mean, should you be involved at that minimal level, sort of multinational, international, or should you be pursuing a global level of involvement? Well, there's 6 questions you can think about. Are the firm needs abroad similar to those in the domestic market? If you are operating, let's just say in the United States, and you're thinking about whether you should be operating in, Canada or Mexico or in Thailand, the first question you want to ask is, are the customer needs there similar to the ones we have in the U.S.? If so, all things equal, that says you might want to be involved or pushing your involvement down toward that global direction. Are the differences in transportation and other costs conducive to producing goods and services abroad? If there are cost differences that can benefit the company, that would push you in the global direction. Are the firm's customers or partners already involved in global business? If you're already working with customers or partners that are involved in these other countries and you're not, well, that can all things equal be pushing you in that direction as well. Will it be difficult to distribute goods and services abroad? If you got distribution problems, maybe because of regulations or technology or even just logistics of moving the products around, then that is an argument against moving toward global involvement. Will government trade policies facilitate global expansion? So do you have trade policies between or trade agreements between countries that might facilitate your company moving and perhaps being in an ownership position in another country? And finally, can managers in one country learn from managers in another? And this is a way that you can really develop synergy. If your managers in one area can improve, or one country can improve their skills by working with managers in another country, then that's a reason to move toward global involvement. Well, this concludes our audio commentary for this chapter.